Hi everyone, I'm Diane with the Climate Science Alliance, and today we're going to be talking about vermicomposting. Vermicomposting is, simply put, composting with the assistance of worms. Before we get into it, let's break down the concept of conventional composting.
Composting is the process of decomposing organic matter, such as food waste, into a nutrient-rich material that is called compost. This compost is beneficial to the soil in numerous ways, acting as a soil conditioner and fertilizer. Additionally, the process of composting diverts organic waste that would otherwise end up in a landfill.
As a proud climate kid, I like to frequently check in with myself and ask, what could I be doing to help the earth? So I looked at my trash.
I noticed that I was frequently dumping my veggie scraps, which are headed straight to the landfill. When my veggie scraps break down in a landfill, they produce greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and its much more potent friend, methane. Both of these greenhouse gases create a heat-trapping blanket around our Earth, causing climate change.
But the good news is that we have a solution: composting. I always thought you needed a big yard or a bulky container to compost at home, but with the help of my friends and the internet, I learned the magic of vermicomposting.
Vermicomposting is different than the conventional composting I had known about because it relies on micro and macroorganisms to break down organic waste instead of heat. So, instead of tending to a large pile of organic matter in a yard, I could compost in a small container inside my apartment.
So let's talk about worms. Before we get started with vermicomposting, it's important to learn about the specific type of worm that you'll need: Icenia fetida, or the red wriggler.
Red wrigglers, also known as a redworm or a tiger worm, like to hang out at the top layers of decomposing organic matter. This is really important because other worms, such as the earthworms that you might have in your backyard, like to dig deep, which simply will not work in a small vermicompost bin. However, even though red wrigglers like to hang out at the surface, they are still sensitive to light and will avoid it. Red wrigglers do best between 55 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which is one more reason to keep them out of the hot sun. Worms in general are mostly made of water, which means they want a moist environment. If their environment is too wet, however, they might have a hard time breathing since they breathe through their skin.
Red wrigglers have been called a tube with a gut, which after spending a few years with them as my housemates, I have to agree with. But by learning more about them, you'll learn that there's a few more things besides food scraps that'll keep them happy. Here's what you need to keep the worms happy in your container.
A container to keep the worms in, a good location for the container, materials for compost, and worms. That's it.
Whether you make your container or you buy one, they all share a few simple characteristics. They need to be able to drain, they need to block out a decent amount of light, and they need to have air holes.
This is my first vermicomposting container, and I used it for over a year. To make it, I drilled drainage holes along the bottom, side, and top of one bucket and stacked it on top of another bucket. You can use the same system with other opaque bins, like storage containers, but just make sure you leave enough room at the bottom for proper drainage. If you want to avoid plastic, you can even create a wooden container. I saved up some money and was able to purchase this larger, fancier bin, but it has all the same characteristics as my DIY one.
Before you pick out your container, it might be helpful to think about where you're going to put it.
Remember, worms like it to be dark and cool. I like to put my bin in my laundry closet. I also think it is important to put it in a place that is easy to access, such as under your kitchen sink, so you remember to check in on your worms. If you put it outside, you might want to think about the potential for weather extremes and unwanted guests. Avoid sunny spots and make a backup plan for storms and heat waves.
While worms are not picky eaters, there are a few very important things that you should not put in your container.
The more obvious ones are meat and dairy products. As you can imagine, you wouldn't want to let this sit in a container for days on end. The less obvious ones include citrus and onions. Worms are very sensitive to these and will not eat them. Surprisingly, you can put pet hair and dust in your container, which is great for me because I have 3 cats. Crushed eggshells are also very beneficial to your compost bin because they raise the pH of your bin, which can sometimes become acidic with certain foods. There are a lot of informative graphics on the internet to learn about what to feed your worms and what to avoid, but this is one that I reference often. It helps to print it out and place it next to the bin so friends and family members know what to avoid.
Besides food scraps, worms also need bedding.
By adding a mix of dry materials, such as shredded paper or cardboard, you'll have a moist environment that isn't completely soaked. While worms need moisture, if it's too wet and too compacted, they won't have enough air. The worms will eat the bedding along with the food scraps, so make sure to add more if you think they need it.
Last but not least, you're going to need some red wrigglers. Your local nursery might have them, but if not, you can always order them online.
You now know what you need to feed them and not feed them, but it's also important that you don't feed them too much. If you notice that it's taking longer than 2 weeks for them to start breaking down your food scraps, you might want to hold off on feeding for another 2 weeks or so. If you don't want to throw your scraps away, you can always put them in the freezer to feed them later. Keep an eye on the bedding to make sure it's moist and aerated. Add water if it seems dry, and add bedding if it seems too wet. If you notice a weird smell or a new bug that seems to be taking over, you can use the internet to pinpoint your problem. I like to refer to this chart. Your worms are happy if they're eating your food scraps at a good pace, and if their bedding smells like the earth does right after a rain.
I started vermicomposting because I wanted to divert food waste from the landfill, but an added bonus is that I now have an endless supply of nutrient-rich fertilizer for my plants.
Over time, your bin will start to accumulate decomposed organic matter and worm castings. Worm castings is a mature way of saying worm poop. It takes a few months to have enough to harvest. There are a few ways to harvest the compost without the worms getting in the way. I prefer the bait and switch method, in which you move all the contents to one side of the container and put new bedding and food scraps on the other side. After a few weeks, most of the worms will have migrated to the new side, so you can easily scoop out what is left. Don't be afraid to use your hands. If the worms or their castings freak you out, you can always use gloves. Just remember to be gentle.
Once you've harvested your castings, you can use it in a number of ways to add nutrients to your soil.
You can mix it in with your potting soil when potting a new houseplant, or add it to your garden soil when planting outside. You can also add the castings to the top of the soil as a fertilizer. Even the leachate, which is the water that is collected at the base of your container, can be used for your plants. To make the so-called worm tea, you just dilute it with a ratio of 10 parts water to 1 part leachate and pour it onto the soil of your houseplants or outdoor plants. Everything I've learned about vermicomposting came from a discussion with friends and resources from the internet. You don't have to be an expert, and you certainly don't need a lot of fancy equipment. All you need is some patience and an open heart towards the often misunderstood worm. Here are the resources I use to learn about vermicomposting. Want to learn about other things you can do to help protect the earth? Visit www.climatekids.org/resources and become a Climate Kid today.